Okay, this is revision session 1 for Elizabeth. 1 of 3. I'll try and do it in 3 because I think there are only 3 different types of question that you'll face on Elizabeth, and they're very straightforward. It's just simply describe 2 features of something for 4 marks, explain why for 12 marks, which is one you've seen before in the Germany unit, and how far do you agree with a statement for 16 marks, which again is something you've seen before. So we can probably do without a separate section, revision session on how to do the different types of question. So I'm going to try and stick to 3. I might have a 4th, but we'll see. So beginning with Elizabeth from 1558 to 69, when she first became queen in 1558 to 69. So this is the first section, which deals with Elizabeth's reign up to 1569. Okay, which deals with issues of legitimacy, whether people believe she should be queen, the religious question and the religious settlement, and Mary, Queen of Scots. Also touch on the economy as well. Okay, so first of all, what was England like when Elizabeth became queen? You've got a very sort of hierarchised country. We've got the nobility at the top, the lords and ladies and dukes and nobles and all the rest of it. We've got the gentry, sir this, that and the other. Beneath them you've got yeomen, Y-E-O-M-E-N, who are sort of well-to-do farmers. Then tenant farmers who have a comfortable living, but they're not particularly well off. And then we've got the landless and working poor, who are the poor. And then you've got the underclass, the homeless and beggars. That's in the countryside. In the town, it's slightly different. In the town, you've got merchants who can be very wealthy. They can be more wealthy than nobility merchants. You've got professionals. They're people with a trade who would serve an apprenticeship for 7 years. Having learned a trade, they become a member of a guild. They will be professionals. Small business owners, skilled craftsmen, and then unskilled workers. And then again, the underclass, the homeless and the beggars. Okay? So it's a very clearly hierarchised society, and there's a lot of poverty during, particularly in the later years of Elizabeth's reign. And we'll look at that in revision session 3. Okay, so a little bit more background on what the government was like when Elizabeth became queen. We've talked about the court. What is the court? It's the people who are close to the queen. They're the nobles. And if you see the queen every day, you can chat to her. That gives you an element of power. So the court were quite powerful. Don't think of a court with judges and lawyers. We're talking about the court that follows the monarch around the country. And then actual government bodies, we've got the Privy Council. Okay, so these are the guys who debate issues, oversee laws, money and parliament. Had 19 members chosen by the Queen herself, and obviously a major player in the Privy Council was going to be William Cecil, who is Secretary of State. Below the Privy Council, you've got Parliament. Now, Parliament is not the body that we are used to. It's not the powerful organisation that we see today. It was a much more kind of advisory body. The Queen didn't even need to call Parliament unless she wanted money, and she could dissolve it as well. She only called Parliament 10 times in the whole of her reign. Okay, so that's a nice statistic. She only called Parliament 10 times in her reign. The Parliament had power over taxes, though. Okay, the monarch had to ask Parliament to charge extra taxes. And just like today, it was made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Local government, you've got Lord's Lieutenant. The Lord Lieutenant is in charge of training local military forces. There's one in every county, so there's the Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire, the Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk and all the rest of it. And these men would also be members of the Privy Council. So Lord's Lieutenant are quite powerful men as well. And they're local government. They're basically the Queen in local government. And then at the very local level, you've got the Justices of the Peace. These are large landowners, yeomen farmers who keep law and order in their local area. Make sure that laws get carried out by their people. This would be an unpaid office, and they would do this for the status that it brought them. Okay. So a little bit more background now on the monarchy. Elizabeth, all monarchs, and all people really, believed in the divine right of king. That's important because when it came to dealing with Mary Queen of Scots, a lot of people think, well, why didn't you just chop Mary Queen of Scots' head off? Well, Mary Queen of Scots was an ordained queen. She was a queen. And to kill a queen is to go against the rule of God, because they rule a country by the grace of God. So this belief in the divine right of the monarch underpins all government, really. And you need to kind of accept that that's an important directive in how a people obey their monarch, and how their monarch has the attitude of the monarch to the people. Okay. But Elizabeth had a lot of power as queen. She could declare war and make peace, call and dismiss parliament, agree to laws, grant titles, money and land to people, and be a patron. Now, patronage, that's quite an important way of governing. To us, it seems like bribery, but patronage, being a patron, giving something to someone in return for their support, was an accepted way of carrying out business. So members of the court, important nobles, would be given monopolies in certain products like sweet wines and things like that. And that would make them wealthy. They would get even richer because of that patronage, and in return Elizabeth would get their support. So be aware of patronage and how that works. Okay, Secretary of State, Queen's second in command, William Cecil. He was a very important person for Elizabeth until he got too old and eventually died, and then his son Robert Cecil took over as an extremely influential character. Eventually William Cecil was made Lord Burghley, and his son Robert Cecil became Lord Salisbury. The Queen could also command extraordinary taxation. Now, in the case of war, Parliament would be called and would almost certainly agree to extraordinary taxation to fund the war. And the royal prerogative is an important feature of government. The Queen could decide unilaterally on issues because she was the Queen. You could just pull that card out of the bag, I'm the Queen, and that's going to happen. So, that's a little bit of background on society and how government was run, and you need to be comfortable using keywords like the court, the Privy Council, Lords Lieutenant, Justices of the Peace, Divine Right of Kings, and know who William Cecil was and all the rest of it. But now we get into questions of Elizabeth's problems that she faced in this period, and a big one was, did she have the right to succeed? Now, if she was legitimate was a big question, because don't forget, her mother had been executed. Her mum was Anne Boleyn, and when Anne Boleyn was executed, her child was declared out of the line of succession. So Elizabeth wasn't really expected to become queen. Don't forget, her younger brother became Edward VI, and her older sister became Mary I. So she was third in line, even if her illegitimacy wasn't in question. So there was a real big question mark hanging over Elizabeth's right to rule. Okay? Be aware of that. That's a big difficulty that she faced. Also, another problem that she faced was whether to get married, and who to marry if she did get married. Should she marry a Catholic prince, a foreign king like Philip II of Spain, as her older sister had? Well, there are many advantages to that. Having a powerful ally like Spain would be great, but would that then make England a satellite country of Spain? Is the King of Spain automatically the King of England? Because don't forget, this is a very patriarchal society. That means that men are believed to be superior to women. So a queen will be subject to the decisions of a king, her husband. But then there was also the advantage of having a child. If she got married, she could have an heir, and that would stabilise things. It would remove the question of Mary Queen of Scots, for one thing. So there are many pros and cons of getting married. Another problem would be if she married an English nobleman. Does that make him king? Does that make him inferior to the Queen, or superior because he's a man? There are all these problems that she faced, and you need to be aware of that problem that she faced and how she resolved it by ultimately deciding to remain single. Although don't forget, she did use sort of political flirting, as we see with the Duke of Alencon. Her gender was an issue as well, because she was a woman. This was a very patriarchal, sexist, for want of a better word, society. And don't forget, the last queen had been a disaster. Her older sister, Mary I, had been an absolute disaster. So she needed to win people over. She needed to kind of convince people that she wasn't going to be another psychopathic religious murderer. And a lot of the kind of impetus behind her via media, the third way in the religious settlement, was to kind of show people that she wasn't her big sister. She was a balanced political animal, and she could make decisions sensibly. But public opinion was that a woman should not be the monarch. Okay, so that's another problem she faced. On the other side, she had a character in her favour. She was extremely intelligent, well educated, had a good knowledge and understanding of politics, spoke many languages, so that would help with international relations, particularly with the French and the Spanish, because they could communicate in Latin as well. She had experience being a prisoner. She'd been imprisoned by her big sister because her big sister suspected her of complicity in rebellion and plots against her. So she knew the dangers that came with life at court, and she could kind of navigate court quite well. But on the downside, she found it difficult to make decisions, so that's why she relied so heavily on the Cecils, William and Robert. And also she had a very bad temper, so this could be seen as a problem as well. In terms of actual problems, political problems that she faced, we'll move on to that now. Okay, first of all, the economic situation that she inherited was dreadful. Her big sister Mary had been fighting costly wars with the Scottish and the French. And so England was £300,000 in debt. That's an enormous amount of money in today's terms. Also, she faced the problem of raising taxes. It's enormously unpopular, and she needs to be popular because she's a woman. She's coming on the back of Mary I. She's a Protestant. What do the Catholics think? We've got all that kind of problem. So she doesn't want to tax people too heavily. So she needs to balance the books. So that's the economy. Another problem would be the wars that she's inherited. A war on two fronts. England sits between France and Scotland. So to the north we've got the danger of Scotland, and to the south we've got the danger of France. And this is the Auld Alliance, A-U-L-D, the Auld Alliance between the Scottish and the French. It sandwiches England right in the middle. She's also lost Calais. Her big sister has lost Calais, the English port in France that had been the last continental possession of the English. Scotland has strong links to France, and Mary, Queen of Scots, is married at this stage to the King of France. So there's constant fighting between the English and the Scots. So big problems that she faces there as soon as she inherits the throne. And also she's got the problem that the two biggest, most powerful countries in Europe at this time are both Catholic, and she is a Protestant, head of a Protestant country. So these are obvious initial problems that she faces. Okay, and then, of course, we've got the big problem of religion, the religious settlement. Because Mary had been queen for 5 years, England was a Catholic country, had been violently turned back into a Catholic country. But Elizabeth was a Protestant, but she was also a balanced, sensible politician, and she knew that to try and convert everyone back to hardline Protestantism was going to be unpopular and dangerous and result in many deaths, so she didn't want to do that either. So she also recognised that many people liked some of the Catholic features. They liked holy days, they liked things like Plough Sunday and the Harvest Festival. And they wanted to confess their sins, and they liked churches to look a certain way with an altar, and they wanted priests to wear certain vestments, like the robes that they wear. But she didn't believe that the Bible should only be in Latin. She believed it should be in English so that everyone could read it. And she didn't believe that priests were the only way to communicate to God. She really believed that people could have a personal relationship with God. These are Protestant beliefs. Okay? So she wanted to carve this kind of middle way between the Reformation of the Protestants on the one hand and the innate Catholicism, Catholic kind of leanings of most English people. And that's where we get the via media, which we'll look at shortly. Okay. Let's go into Protestant beliefs a little bit more. Protestant beliefs would be that the king or the queen is the leader of the church in England, not the Pope. That the Bible should be in English rather than in Latin, so that everyone can read it. That church decorations should be minimal, if not completely removed, because they're a distraction from the worship of God. There is no mention of bishops in the Bible, so why have them? Get rid of bishops. Plain and simple churches, no popes, and sins can be forgiven by God and not the priest, not the church. The idea that miracles do not exist and that priests are allowed to marry. These are all Protestant beliefs. Okay. Then Catholic beliefs, of course. The Pope is the leader of the church, not the monarch. Bishops and priests lead the church. Bible should be in Latin. Miracles and saints are real. Churches should be decorated to honour the glory of God, and priests should not be allowed to marry. So there's obvious conflict between Protestant beliefs and Catholic beliefs, and Elizabeth kind of wanted to kind of carve this middle way. Know your background as well. Know where Protestantism in England began. It began with Elizabeth's own father, Henry VIII, when he broke with the Catholic Church. And he created this problem. He had 3 children. 2 were Protestant and 1 remained Catholic, Mary, of course. And when they all inherited in turn, they brought England backwards and forwards between Protestantism and Catholicism. So this was a problem that Elizabeth, the third of them, wanted to resolve. So she wanted to, these are the problems where it says Elizabeth's main religious problems. She wanted to resolve the tension between Catholics and Protestants. She wanted to resolve this geographical division between Catholics and Protestants. London tended to be more Protestant. The north tended to be more Catholic. Rural areas tended to be more Catholic. Puritanism, extreme Catholicism, was in certain areas as well, which she needed to resolve. So she came up with this compromise, the religious settlement. Now, the features of the religious settlement were threefold. First of all, there was the Act of Supremacy. This made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England. Okay. All the clergy had to swear an oath honouring the Act of Supremacy, swearing their loyalty to Elizabeth. Okay, so that's the Act of Supremacy. Then there's the Act of Uniformity, which is that all church services should be the same, follow the same rules. All priests should wear the same type of vestments. Okay, uniformity. Standardization. Everyone should behave the same way in church. Everyone had to attend church on a Sunday and holy days and be fined if they became what was known as recusants, which is failing to go to church and going to Catholic Mass instead. And the third aspect of the religious settlement was royal injunctions. The same words had to be read out and the same clothes had to be worn by the priest. A set of instructions on a range of issues to make sure the clergy were following the same acts and people were worshipping in the right way. Each parish had to have a copy of the English Bible, and no one was allowed to preach unless they had a license from the government. Anyone not following these instructions could be punished, and people were, which we'll look at when we look at the challenges to the religious settlement. So what was the impact of the religious settlement? Well, first of all, 8,000 priests took the oath of supremacy to the Queen in over 10,000 parishes, so it was mainly successful. You might be asked to describe features of the religious settlement, so be prepared to do that. Only 1 bishop agreed to take the oath, so the others were sacked. So Elizabeth had to appoint 27 new Protestant bishops. So there was a shortage of qualified clergy in Britain for a brief period. Most people, however, accepted Elizabeth's settlement. Most people attended the church services. Many kept to the old Catholic beliefs, but they did it in secret, and it was okay. Elizabeth wasn't one for... She said, it's not my business to make windows into men's souls. In other words, behave yourself, go to Protestant Mass, and what you do in your own house is your own affair. So if you want to have Catholic Masses in your own home, then fine, do it. Most people accepted the wording of the new Bible as it was made relevant to both Catholics and Protestants. That's quite an important point. She was able to kind of change the wording of the prayer book in such a way as to make it... to fudge the issue of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, that's a good one if you're aiming for your 8s and your 9s. Transubstantiation is the belief that during a Catholic Mass, the bread and the wine actually physically changes into the body and blood of Jesus. Protestants would argue that you don't need that at all. You don't need to have the bread and the wine. And if you do have it, it's only symbolic. But she managed to have the prayer book written in such a way as to kind of make it seem applicable to both. It could seem symbolic, it could seem real, depending on how you interpreted it. Okay? So, most people accepted the religious settlement. Most people accepted it. Going into the 3 aspects in a little bit more detail. The Act of Supremacy made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the church. A high commission was set up to make sure that everyone followed the rules. Clergy members, that's the priests, could be punished if they didn't follow them. The Act of Uniformity set out the appearance and rules of the church. A common book of prayer was to be used. The wording was vague, so transubstantiation, for example, could be believed by both, whichever side you were on. Clergy could be punished, and then the royal injunctions with a set of rules for the clergy, how they should dress, how they should act. Only people with a license were allowed to do that. So know your religious settlement inside and out. Okay? Moving on, recusants, those people who refuse to follow the new church services, usually Catholics. Features of how the church checked the settlement. Well, there were church courts set up, so the church made sure that people in England followed the new rules of birth, marriage and death, enforcing the settlement. 400 clergy were sacked because of inspections that were carried out. Other professions such as teachers, midwives and doctors were also checked to make sure that they had a license and were following the same rules. Okay, so there were ways of enforcing it. Inspections are the main one, and know your 400 clergy being sacked. That's a nice detail. Church courts were set up as well, so make sure you know that. Despite all that, there were challenges. Now, there were challenges from Puritans and there were challenges from Catholics. Challenges from Puritans, first of all, there was the crucifix controversy, which the Puritans didn't believe that the symbol of the crucifix should be used. They thought it was an insult. Some churches, some Puritan churches, disobeyed them, but Elizabeth let them get away with it. Okay, she was all right. It's not a big issue. Let that one ride. The vestment controversy, on the other hand, was Elizabeth kind of met that one head on. Puritans did not think that priests should have special clothes, vestments. Others believed they should be plain and simple. However, Elizabeth used the royal injunctions to make sure that the clergy did wear their special vestments. She won on this one, okay? In 1566, the Archbishop of Canterbury held special exhibition in London to show priests what they should wear. 37 refused to attend, and so they lost their jobs. Okay, so she was pretty strict on the vestments. So that was the challenge from the Puritans. The challenge from the Catholics was a little bit more of a threat, as we'll see when we look at the later reign of Elizabeth. Many Catholics still believe the Pope should be the head of the Church in England. The Counter-Reformation is the fight back against the Protestant changes. So many Catholics wanted to fight against the Protestant Church, and they waged war against what they called the heretics. Heretics is anyone who disagrees with the Catholic Church. The Northern Earls, the north of England in general, really remained Catholic. 1/3 of the nobility were recusants. They were Catholics who didn't follow the new church. That's quite a big problem for Elizabeth when you think of it. 1/3 of the nobles were recusants.
How much? 125 of those sheets.
Please. All right. The nobility were a threat. When we see the revolt of the Northern Earls, we can see how that's a big problem. The Earl of Northumberland, for example, is a leading Catholic at this time. We'll look at the revolt of the Northern Earls later. Okay, so challenges to the religious settlement from abroad. Obviously, France and Spain and the Spanish Netherlands are big problems. She wants to keep them on, so she doesn't want to get involved in the wars of religion. She wants to keep England out of costly overseas wars. She signs the Treaty of Troyes, which kind of surrenders Calais permanently. It was her big sister Mary I who lost Calais, but signing the Treaty of Troyes sort of says we'll not even try to get Calais back. However, she kind of toes this middle line. She tells Philip of Spain that she supports Protestants in France, Huguenots they're called, and she also supports the Dutch Protestants in the Spanish Netherlands. So King Philip of Spain is immediately on the back foot with Elizabeth. Okay. In Spain and the Spanish Netherlands, we've got here Philip of Spain was a strict Catholic, like the world's #1 Catholic next to the Pope, Philip II. He didn't like Elizabeth supporting French Huguenot Protestants. He banned the import of English cloth for a year, harming the English economy. There was a trade embargo between England and the Spanish Netherlands. They didn't trade with one another. And then we've got the Dutch revolt in the Netherlands. Because the Netherlands belonged to Spain in the 1550s, Philip brought over the Spanish Inquisition. Non-Catholics were tortured and killed, and he brought over 10,000 Spanish soldiers as well. This was a big threat to Elizabeth because they're just across the water, just across the English Channel. There's 10,000 Spanish Catholic soldiers. Philip also sets up the Council of Blood to make sure that everyone is obeying the Catholic laws. Thousands of Protestants are killed, and Elizabeth is kind of voicing her support for these Protestants who are being killed and persecuted as a result of the Spanish Inquisition in the Spanish Netherlands. She gives them support, not direct military support, but she allows the Dutch rebels to travel to England and have safety in England. She supports the sea beggars. Okay, these are kind of Dutch Protestant exiles and pirates to a degree who kind of raid Spanish ships. So it's a threat. Explaining, let's have a look at why other countries were a threat or a challenge to Elizabeth's religious settlement. The Spanish Catholic army could have invaded England across the English Channel at any time. The Spanish Inquisition could influence Catholic rebellion in England. Remember, there's lots of Catholics. A third of the nobility in England are Catholics. Spanish-controlled Netherlands was very close to England. The religious war that's going on between the Protestant Huguenots and the Catholics in France could also influence a war in England. So Elizabeth's afraid of that. And she wants, remember, at all costs to avoid war as it's expensive. She was put under pressure from leading Protestants to deal with Spain. So she's got to get tough. Protestants in England are leaning on Elizabeth to be tough and support the sea beggars and things like that. So one of the things she does is she takes gold from an Italian ship that was meant to go to the Catholic Spanish. She confiscates that ship when it sort of takes shelter in an English port to avoid the sea beggars, and she takes that money. It's called the Genoese loan. This really upsets Philip and made Elizabeth worry about an attack. Any action against the Catholics would annoy Philip II of Spain and possibly drag England into a war, as eventually does happen in 1588. And then the last big problem that we've got in this period is the problem of Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay, first of all, why did Mary, Queen of Scots not like Elizabeth? It's not that they didn't like one another, it's just that she was a danger to Elizabeth. She was the Catholic Queen of the Scottish. She had powerful connections with the French, not only through her husband, but also her mother, Mary of Guise. So the old alliance is alive and embodied in Mary. Okay, this becomes a big problem for Elizabeth when Mary's accused of murdering her husband, Lord Darnley. Okay, she is forced to abdicate by John Knox and the Scottish leaders. She gives up her throne. Is imprisoned in a castle on a Scottish island and escapes in 1568 to start a new army. Eventually, her son, who becomes James I of England, is confiscated from her, and she legs it to England. And she's imprisoned under house arrest in various castles. And she really does become a kind of focal point for rebellions against Elizabeth's rule. It's no coincidence, or perhaps it is a coincidence, but it's a strange coincidence, that the revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569 happens almost immediately after Mary is imprisoned in England. So we've got this Catholic heir who's a popular Catholic figure in England, ready to take the throne. All it needs is for Elizabeth to be killed, and then England becomes a Catholic country again. Okay, So there is a big danger that is posed by Mary Queen of Scots. So she's kept under house arrest, she's kept under guard, she's kept comfortable, but she is definitely under the thumb of Elizabeth the whole time. So, was the religious settlement successful? Elizabeth's middle way was accepted by Catholics and Protestants on the whole. There was a growth of the Protestant religion in England. Recusants were not treated harshly like under other monarchs. There were inspections and royal injunctions to make sure the rules were being followed. Elizabeth did not kill Mary Queen of Scots, but just kept her out of the way. Catholic Spain and France did not invade England, although the threat and the danger was always there. And Elizabeth did not send English troops to help the Dutch revolt against the Catholics. So we've got this kind of precarious balance at the end of this period. And the next revision session will look at challenges to Elizabeth from 1569 to 88. Encompassing all the plots against Elizabeth, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington, etc. Revolt of the Northern Earls is the first one, and also straight up to the Spanish Armada.